He was the perfect American dream: sun-bleached hair, chiseled jawline, and eyes that made teenage girls across the country swoon. Troy Donahue wasn't just a star, he was a symbol. A clean-cut heartthrob who graced the covers of teen magazines, stole scenes in steamy summer romances, and became the fantasy boyfriend of a generation. But while fans saw the dreamy boy next door, behind closed doors, Troy Donahue was living a very different reality. Because the truth is, he was hiding something. Something that would have destroyed his career if it ever got out. Donahue was one of many actors trapped in a system that cared less about truth and more about image. Hollywood's golden age wasn't golden for everyone. It was a place where secrets weren't just dangerous, they were mandatory. And if you were a young actor who didn't fit the mold, you learned how to pretend. You learned how to smile through the lies. And you learned how to bury the parts of yourself the studios refused to acknowledge. It wasn't until decades later, after the spotlight had faded, after the marriages failed, after the addiction nearly ended him, that Donahue finally spoke. Quietly, cautiously, but truthfully. In hushed interviews, he began to reveal a side of his life that had been erased from public memory. A hidden truth that not only reshaped how people saw him, but how they saw the entire industry. And then, he dropped names. Names that stunned even those who thought they knew everything about old Hollywood. Names of fellow icons who had also lived behind the curtain. And when Troy Donahue finally revealed who he had secretly dated, fans realized this wasn't just another Hollywood love story. It was a window into a secret world. A world of stolen glances, whispered meetings, and love that had to be hidden in the shadows. And the men he named? You've heard of them. But you've never heard this story. Before he was Troy Donahue, he was Merle Johnson Jr., a New York City kid from a privileged background, raised by a corporate father and a mother with Broadway dreams. But Troy didn't want boardrooms or theater footlights. He wanted Hollywood. And when he arrived in the late 1950s, the studio system wasted no time turning him into their next big star. Warner Brothers gave him a new name, sculpted his image, and handed him a script that would define him: the golden boy romantic lead. His breakout role in A Summer Place launched him into teen idol status almost overnight. He wasn't just acting, he was packaged, polished, and sold as the ultimate boyfriend. America fell in love with the fantasy. He starred alongside Sandra Dee in A Tale of Forbidden Love, and every girl wanted to be in her shoes. His soft-spoken charm, sun-kissed look, and gentle masculinity became the blueprint for heartthrobs across the country. Hollywood didn't just make stars back then, it manufactured identities. And Troy's new image came with a contract, both written and unspoken. He was now property of the system, and that meant fitting the mold. No rumors, no controversy, and absolutely no secrets that could taint the fantasy. But behind the bright lights and fan mail was a young man forced to split himself in two. One version smiled on red carpets and played the part. The other lived in fear that even a single slip-up could destroy everything. Because back then, the wrong kind of truth could end your career before it started. The same machine that made Troy famous was also watching his every move. And what it demanded in return for stardom was silence, especially when it came to who you really were. In 1950s Hollywood, being different wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. The industry was ruthless about appearances, and Troy Donahue knew exactly what was at stake. Studios didn't just manage careers, they controlled lives. If an actor's personal truth didn't match the brand they were selling, that truth had to disappear. Donahue was groomed as the all-American dreamboat, every move choreographed, every relationship monitored. And while his female co-stars changed with each new role, the script behind the scenes stayed the same. Keep quiet, keep smiling, and never let anyone get too close. But the truth was always there, just beneath the surface. Troy didn't date like other leading men. He couldn't, not openly. Because in an era when a single whisper could blacklist you for life, he was forced to love in silence. He wasn't alone. There was a hidden network in Hollywood. Actors, singers, dancers, all of them navigating fame while hiding their real lives. Private parties, coded language, secret getaways. That's how they survived. Troy once said, "You could lose everything," and he meant it. Careers had vanished overnight for less. The fear was constant. The pressure to perform wasn't just on screen, it was personal. it was suffocating, and it was deadly serious. While fans adored the polished image of Troy Donahue, the man behind it was learning how to live a double life. Smile for the cameras, pretend in interviews, and when the night came, disappear into the shadows where he could be himself, even if only for a few hours. This wasn't about scandal, it was about survival. The rules were clear: be who we say you are, or be no one at all. And for years, Troy followed those rules, until one day, long after the spotlight had moved on, he decided to break them. Of all the names Troy Donahue would eventually whisper in quiet, reflective interviews, one stood out, not just for who he was, but for what their connection represented. That name was Anthony Perkins. To the world, Perkins was the haunting face behind Norman Bates in Psycho, brooding, intense, magnetic. But behind the chilling performances was a man as conflicted and cautious as Donahue. Both were rising stars, both meticulously crafted by Hollywood handlers, and both were carrying secrets that could destroy them. They met at a party in the late 1950s, one of those private industry gatherings where stars could breathe, just for a night. Perkins was already earning critical acclaim. Donahue was the new golden boy. The chemistry, by all accounts, was immediate. But in an industry built on fantasy, there was no room for a connection like theirs. So they learned to live in the margins. Donahue later recalled, "We could never go out in public together. We had to pretend, always pretend." They'd drive out to the California coast in the dead of night, just to sit in silence by the ocean, talking, holding hands in the dark. Sometimes they wouldn't even speak, just listen to the waves, knowing that those stolen moments were the only peace they'd get. Perkins, like Donahue, was shackled by the same invisible chains. His studio contracts, his public image, his fanbase, none of it left room for authenticity. And as they navigated the brutal balancing act between public fantasy and private truth, they grew close, not just romantically, but emotionally. They understood each other in ways no one else could. "There was a gentleness to him," Donahue said. "He understood what it was to live behind a mask. But masks have consequences. The more they wore them, the more isolated they became." Their relationship, while powerful, couldn't last under the weight of fear. Eventually, life and the machine pulled them in different directions. Perkins dove deeper into complex roles and inner turmoil. Donahue tried to keep up appearances, smiling for cameras that never saw the real him. What they had was real, but it had to be erased. Because in that era, even love had to fit the narrative, and theirs never would. Decades later, Donahue didn't name Perkins to cause a stir. He named him to remember, to say out loud what they never could back then, and to finally, quietly, honor a man who once held his heart in the shadows. The second name Troy Donahue hinted at was even bigger, almost too big to believe. Rock Hudson. To the public, Hudson was the embodiment of rugged American masculinity. 6'4", square-jawed, the perfect leading man. He wasn't just a star, he was a brand. Women adored him. Studios protected him. And behind all that charm was a man living a life just as fractured as Donahue's. Donahue never described it as a full-blown relationship, but what he did say hinted at something more than friendship, something fleeting, complicated, and unspoken. He recalled moments, looks, shared silences, glimpses of understanding in a world that didn't allow them to say what they felt. "Rock had it harder than most of us," Donahue said. "He was bigger than life. If he slipped up, the whole house of cards would fall." They didn't meet up the way couples do. There were no dates, no phone calls, no photographs, just carefully timed meetings, brief conversations at trusted homes, moments that had to vanish as quickly as they appeared. There was an invisible line between them, drawn not by a lack of connection, but by the crushing weight of what the world expected them to be. They weren't just men trying to find love. They were icons trying not to lose everything. Donahue described it as a kind of silent bond. "There were times, just quiet, fleeting times, where we shared something no one else could see," he said. "We were men who were supposed to be everything America dreamed of, and we were so afraid of losing it all." Hudson, more than anyone, symbolized the danger of being found out. Even years later, after his diagnosis with a terminal illness forced the world to confront the truth, the media treated it like a scandal rather than a tragedy. That fear, of exposure, of rejection, of ruin, had kept him hidden for decades. And for Donahue, that fear was familiar. The connection they shared wasn't built on public declarations. It was built on mutual survival. And in the rare, unguarded moments they had, it was enough to know they weren't alone. But even those quiet moments had to end, and the spotlight would eventually turn harsh on them both. By the end of the 1960s, the world Troy Donahue was built for had disappeared. The Hollywood fantasy of golden-haired boys and beachside romance was being replaced with something darker, grittier, more real. Audiences wanted anti-heroes now. Studio idols like Troy suddenly looked out of place, left behind by a culture they once defined. And just like that, the offers stopped coming. The man who once received mountains of fan mail now couldn't land a role. His clean-cut image, once an asset, became a prison. The roles dried up, the spotlight dimmed, and the mask he had worn for so long started to crumble. Without work, without purpose, and still carrying the weight of secrets he couldn't share, Troy began to spiral. He turned to alcohol, hard. What started as a coping mechanism soon became a full-blown addiction. He was no longer the leading man with a polished smile. He was just another fallen star trying to stay afloat. There were nights he didn't remember and mornings he wished never came. At his lowest point, he was living out of his car, homeless, penniless, and invisible in the same town where he'd once been idolized. He went from magazine covers to begging for roles, struggling to get through the day without a drink. His personal life fared no better. Failed marriages, broken relationships, a lawsuit that accused him of violence during an engagement. Stories the tabloids devoured. It was a far cry from the golden boy fans remembered. And yet, through the fog of addiction and regret, Donahue still held on to one thing: honesty. Even in the depths of his collapse, he never made excuses. He knew exactly what had happened, and why. Hollywood had chewed him up and spat him out. But he also knew he had to take responsibility for what came after. And slowly, painfully, that's exactly what he did. By the 1990s, Troy Donahue was no longer chasing fame, he was chasing peace. Years of recovery had forced him to confront more than just addiction. He began to unpack the full weight of his past, the image he lived for others, the lies he told to survive, and the love he was never allowed to have. Hollywood had changed, slowly. Conversations that would have ended careers in the 50s were finally being spoken out loud. And while Troy didn't make a press tour of confessions or sell tell-all stories for headlines, he did start opening up in quiet interviews, nostalgia panels, and private conversations. For the first time, he talked about the truth he had buried for decades. That yes, he had been in relationships with men. That yes, he had fallen in love behind closed doors with actors who were just as scared as he was. He wasn't trying to shock anyone. He wasn't even trying to make a point. He was simply tired of pretending. After all the pain, after all the silence, Troy Donahue wanted to reclaim the pieces of himself that had been lost in the machine. When he named Anthony Perkins and hinted at Rock Hudson, it wasn't to scandalize. It was to honor, to say, we were there, we existed, we mattered. These weren't casual flings. These were moments of connection in a world that offered them nothing but fear. He called the studio system a machine that erased real people, and for years he had allowed himself to be one of its victims. Speaking out, however quietly, was his way of refusing to stay buried. He didn't care about image anymore. He cared about truth, and in telling it, he gave voice to an entire generation of closeted stars who had died with their secrets. For Troy Donahue, it wasn't about making headlines. It was about healing a lifetime of silence. Troy Donahue's story could have ended in tragedy. But somehow, it didn't. After years of addiction, failed marriages, and emotional wreckage, he found his way back to something that looked like peace. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't headline-worthy. But it was real. He got sober. He started attending Alcoholics Anonymous regularly and spoke candidly about his journey, never sugarcoating it, never pretending to be anything other than a man who had been broken and was trying to rebuild. For fans who had once idolized him, this version of Troy was even more powerful than the heartthrob on the movie screen. And just when it seemed like he had lost everything, life gave him something back, a son he never knew he had. Sean, the product of a brief relationship from 1969, came into Donahue's life as an adult. Their reunion hit him hard, another reminder of the time he had lost, the chances he'd missed. But it also gave him purpose, a second shot at fatherhood, even if only symbolically. He also found love again, not in the tabloids, but in the arms of Jen Chow, a Chinese-American mezzo-soprano opera singer who brought a sense of calm and compassion into his life. They weren't married, but by all accounts, they were deeply connected. She wasn't part of the Hollywood world, and maybe that's exactly what he needed. In the years leading up to his death, Donahue appeared at nostalgia conventions, film retrospectives, and small TV guest spots. He embraced his past, not with bitterness, but with a kind of humble gratitude. He knew what he had meant to people. And now, they knew who he really was. On September 2, 2001, after suffering 2 heart attacks and undergoing emergency surgery, Troy Donahue passed away at the age of 65. But by then, he had already done something extraordinary. He had reclaimed his story, not the version Hollywood created, but the one he had lived, flawed, human, and finally, free. Troy Donahue's legacy isn't just about the movies he starred in or the image he once represented. It's about what he survived, what he hid, and what he finally had the courage to say out loud. He lived in an era that demanded perfection, but he was human. He gave the world a carefully crafted fantasy while quietly carrying the truth of who he really was. And in the end, he chose honesty over legacy, vulnerability over silence. By naming the 2 men he loved, Anthony Perkins and, quietly, Rock Hudson, he wasn't just revealing a secret. He was breaking a cycle of shame, fear, and forced erasure that haunted generations of performers in Hollywood. He didn't live to see the industry fully change, but he did live long enough to tell his truth. And sometimes, that's all a person really wants, to be remembered as they truly were. Not as a headline, not as a scandal, but as a man who loved, lost, and finally, told the world.